Jephthah's vow. The account of Jephthah in the book of Judges 11, verse 30 to 39 is a complex and consequential narrative centered on a military leader from a humble social background. Appointed as the head of Israel's army to fight the Ammonites, Jephthah made a pivotal vow. In a critical moment before battle, he pledged to the Lord, "If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering." The Lord granted Jephthah a resounding victory. However, upon his return home, the first figure to emerge to greet him with dancing and tambourines was his only daughter. Verse 35 records Jephthah's devastated emotional response, "Oh no, my daughter, you have brought me down." This event has sparked profound theological debate. Many interpreters believe that Jephthah, bound by his vow, literally presented his daughter as a burnt offering. This view highlights the story as a tragic example of a rashly spoken oath and the effects of religious zeal, especially since human sacrifice is explicitly forbidden in the law of Moses, Leviticus 18, verse 21, Deuteronomy 12, verse 31. Alternatively, a minority interpretation argues that the daughter was dedicated to a life of perpetual virginity in service at the tabernacle, a view supported by the text's note that she never knew a man. Culturally, the narrative ironically shows how an Israelite hero could emulate the very practices of the surrounding nations he was meant to oppose. Rituals to Moloch. One of the most severely condemned practices in the Bible is the ritual of offering children to a deity known as Moloch. This practice was believed to be characteristic of Ammonite worship and involved a ritual of passing children through fire. Leviticus 18, verse 21 contains a direct prohibition from the Lord. "Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Moloch, for you must not profane the name of your God." This command underscores how fundamentally the practice conflicts with the core tenets of Yahwism, which uphold the sanctity of life. Nevertheless, historical accounts in the Bible indicate that this ritual occurred during periods of Israel's spiritual decline, notably under kings like Ahaz and Manasseh, who were even recorded to have made their own sons pass through the fire. Historians and theologians believe the phrase "pass through the fire" refers to a literal act, not merely a symbolic one. Non-biblical sources such as the writings of Plutarch and Diodorus Siculus describe similar practices in Carthage. The prophet Jeremiah specifically mentions this ritual being performed in the valley of Ben Hinnom and affirms God's position on it. "They have built the high places to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, something I did not command, nor did it enter my mind." Jeremiah 7, verse 31. From an anthropological perspective, this ritual represents an extreme form of a propitiatory cult. The location, Gehenna, or the Valley of Ben Hinnom, later became a symbol for hell in the teachings of Jesus, a place synonymous with unquenchable judgmental fire. The command of Herum. The command to carry out Herum, or total consecration to destruction, against the Amalekites is one of the most controversial and challenging divine instructions in the Old Testament. In 1 Samuel 15, verse 3, the Lord, through the prophet Samuel, gives an explicit command to King Saul. "Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys." This was not merely a directive for war, but a command for a complete and ritualistic annihilation. In the ancient context, Herum was a form of offering where the enemy was considered so utterly devoted to destruction that their entire existence, including their possessions, had to be eradicated and could not be taken as spoils of war. The reason for this severe directive is rooted in a long history of animosity. The Amalekites were the first to attack Israel after their exodus from Egypt, Exodus 17, and the Lord had declared in Deuteronomy 25 that the memory of Amalek was to be blotted out. Thus, the command to Saul is seen as the execution of a divine judgment announced centuries earlier. However, from a modern ethical standpoint, this command raised profound questions about justice and morality. Ultimately, Saul failed to obey this command completely, sparing King Agag and the best of the livestock. This disobedience became the primary reason the Lord rejected him as king, an event that Jewish tradition holds had long-term consequences, as Haman, the adversary of the Jews in the book of Esther, is believed to be a descendant of Agag. The consequence of siege. One of the most harrowing depictions in the Bible is the act of cannibalism committed by mothers against their own children. This is not presented as a ritual, but as an extreme consequence of divine curses and the complete breakdown of the social order during wartime. This phenomenon was first prophesied in Deuteronomy 28, verse 53 to 57, as part of a list of curses for violating the covenant with God. The text foretells, "You will eat the fruit of the womb, the flesh of the sons and daughters the Lord your God has given you in the siege and distress with which your enemy will oppress you." This prophecy became a recorded reality in Israel's history. In 2 Kings 6, verse 28 to 29, during the siege of Samaria by King Ben-Hadad of Aram, a woman reports to the king of Israel that she and another woman had agreed to consume their children sequentially. This tragic account demonstrates an absolute moral collapse where the instinct for survival overpowers the most fundamental human affections. The Book of Lamentations, 4 verse 10, written by the prophet Jeremiah after the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC, echoes the same horror. With their own hands, compassionate women have cooked their own children, who became their food during the destruction of my people. The context was the brutal siege by Babylon, where prolonged starvation obliterated all social norms and compassion. Theologically, the Bible presents this event as the pinnacle of the consequences of collective sin. Not as a divine command, it stands as the ultimate symbol of a curse, where a society that abandons God's law ultimately loses its own humanity. The ritual of animal sacrifice. The core of the Old Testament worship system was an elaborate series of animal offerings meticulously detailed in the book of Leviticus. There were 5 main types of sacrifices: the burnt offering, the grain offering, the fellowship offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering. Among these, the burnt and sin offerings most centrally involved the ritualistic slaughter of an animal and the handling of its blood. The procedure was highly specific. A priest or the worshiper himself would sacrifice an animal, which could be a bull, goat, sheep, or bird, before the tabernacle. The animal's blood was then collected and sprinkled on the sides of the altar, or in some cases applied to the horns of the altar. This act was based on the theological principle stated in Leviticus 17, verse 11. "For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar." Thus, blood functioned as a symbol of life, with sacrifice being the means to achieve forgiveness for sin. Following the slaughter, parts of the animal, such as the fat, kidneys, and liver, were completely burned as an offering to God, the aroma of which was described as pleasing to the Lord. Leviticus 1 verse 9. For ancient societies, this was the highest form of devotion. From a modern perspective, the atmosphere of this ritual, with numerous animals being sacrificed, blood being handled, and the smoke of burning flesh, vividly illustrates the seriousness of sin and the high price of atonement. In Christian theology, this entire system is ultimately superseded by the final sacrifice of Jesus, who is called the Lamb of God. The Golden Calf Incident. This event occurred at a pivotal moment in Israel's history shortly after their liberation from Egypt. While Moses was on Mount Sinai receiving God's law, the people grew impatient and demanded that Aaron make them gods who will go before us. Aaron then fashioned a golden calf, an act that directly referenced the sacred bull cults of Egypt, such as the worship of Apis. The worship that ensued was described as a wild festival. Exodus 32 verse 6 states, "They sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry," a phrase often connoting immoral pagan rituals in its ancient Hebrew context. When Moses descended from the mountain and witnessed this profound transgression, he became enraged, shattered the stone tablets of the law, and then issued a stern command. He called upon the tribe of Levi, the only group that remained loyal, to take up their swords and enforce discipline. The directive was to slay anyone involved, regardless of their relationship as a brother, friend, or neighbor. The biblical text records the Levites did as Moses commanded, and that day about 3,000 of the people died. This act is not portrayed as mere spontaneous retaliation, but as a ritual cleansing of the community from the grave sin of idolatry, which was considered a capital offense under theocratic law. The event served as a severe lesson that in a covenant community, a lapse in faith by some could endanger the entire nation. Interestingly, many theologians draw a parallel between the 3,000 who died here and the 3,000 who were converted and saved on the day of Pentecost in Acts 2. The execution by Elijah. The context for this dramatic event is the reign of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel in the northern kingdom of Israel, a period when the worship of the Canaanite deity Baal was rampant. Jezebel, a fervent devotee of Baal, was responsible for the persecution and killing of many of the Lord's prophets. In response, the prophet Elijah emerged as a figure who challenged the entire system of Baalism in a public confrontation on Mount Carmel. Elijah gathered all of Israel along with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. He proposed a test. Each side would prepare a sacrifice on an altar without lighting it, and the deity who answered with fire from heaven would be acknowledged as the one true God. The prophets of Baal cried out all day, dancing and even cutting themselves with swords in accordance with their rituals, but there was no response. In contrast, after Elijah offered a simple prayer, fire from the Lord descended and consumed his sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water in the trench around the altar. Following this decisive victory, Elijah gave a firm command. All the prophets of Baal were to be seized. He then took them down to the Kishon Valley and executed them. This action, while severe from a modern perspective, was seen as a lawful act within Israel's theocratic framework. The law of Moses in Deuteronomy 13 explicitly prescribed the death penalty for those who promoted idolatry. Therefore, Elijah's action functioned as a national spiritual cleansing, a radical effort to purge syncretism and decisively reestablish the exclusive worship of Yahweh, marking a turning point in Israel's spiritual history. Abraham's covenant. The event in Genesis 15 is one of the most ancient and symbolic rituals in the Bible, establishing God's covenant with Abraham. When God renewed his promise to give Abraham land and countless descendants, Abraham asked for a sign. God then instructed Abraham to perform an ancient Near Eastern blood covenant ritual. Abraham took a heifer, a female goat, a ram, a dove, and a young pigeon. He cut the larger animals into two pieces and arranged the halves opposite each other. In ancient cultures, the two parties making a covenant would walk together between the pieces of flesh. This act was a solemn, self-maledictory oath, implying that if either party were to break the covenant, they would suffer the same fate as the dissected animals. However, in this narrative, something unique and highly significant occurs. As night fell and Abraham was in a deep sleep, only God himself, symbolized by a smoking fire pot and a blazing torch, passed between the pieces. Abraham did not walk through. This signified that the covenant was unilateral or unconditional. God bound himself with the most sacred oath to keep his promise, placing the entire burden of fulfillment upon himself. The atmosphere of the ritual is described as deeply awe-inspiring. Verse 12 notes that a thick and dreadful darkness came over Abraham, emphasizing the solemnity and sacredness of the moment. This ritual becomes a foundational text for understanding a divine commitment that is irrevocable. Ezekiel's baking bread. In the book of Ezekiel, we find one of the most unusual and jarring prophetic acts ever commanded by God. To illustrate the state of impurity and hardship that the people of Israel would endure in exile, God instructed the prophet Ezekiel to bake bread not over a normal fire, but using human waste as fuel. The explicit command was, "Eat the food as you would a barley cake, bake it in the sight of the people, using human excrement for fuel." The bread itself was to be made from a mixture of various grains, including wheat, barley, and several types of beans, symbolizing the scarcity of food and nutritional hardship during the siege of Jerusalem. This was not a recipe, but a visual representation of suffering. Ezekiel, being a priest and deeply committed to the laws of purity in the Torah, was greatly distressed by this command. Direct contact with human waste, let alone using it to cook, was a profoundly unclean and profane act for him. He pleaded with God, "Sovereign Lord, I have never defiled myself." In response to his plea, God granted him a concession, allowing him to use cow dung as a substitute. Although a lesser impurity, this was still a jarring and ritually unclean act. This symbolic performance served as a stark warning to Israel. As a consequence of their sin and rebellion, their life in exile would become unclean and degraded, with even the most basic necessity of food becoming a symbol of their defilement and divine judgment. The crucifixion of Jesus Christ. The crucifixion of Jesus Christ is not only the central event of Christian teaching, but also one of the most severe methods of execution in history. Historically, crucifixion was a Roman practice designed to inflict a slow public death, maximizing suffering and serving as a powerful deterrent to rebellion. Its victims were typically slaves, rebels, and low-class criminals. The process began with scourging, flagellatio, using a barbed whip that tore the skin and flesh. Afterward, the condemned was forced to carry his cross, most likely the horizontal beam, patibulum, to the site of execution. There his hands and feet were nailed to the wood. This position made breathing extremely difficult, forcing the victim to constantly push up to draw breath, leading to extreme exhaustion and eventual respiratory failure. Theologically, however, the crucifixion of Jesus holds a much deeper meaning. He is called the Lamb of God, and his death is seen as a fulfillment of the entire Old Testament sacrificial system. It represents the ultimate sacrifice, not of an innocent animal, but of a sinless man who died to atone for the sins of humanity. The book of Hebrews explains that Jesus' sacrifice was a once-for-all time fulfillment. Thus, the crucifixion of Jesus is a profound paradox. The Roman Empire's cruelest instrument of public humiliation and execution was transformed into the primary symbol of salvation, forgiveness, and spiritual victory in the Christian faith. The event is the climax of the gospel narrative, a stark depiction of love and suffering, rich with theological significance.